Good evening. For the first keynote speech of the evening, we have a person who needs no introduction. And when you have a person who needs no introduction, it's very hard to introduce him. Nevertheless, the person we have this evening is a very distinguished expert in the fields of finance and economics. He has been with the World Bank, with IMF, and he's been a statesman who has advised prime ministers. He's been a leader who has been in the government, helping frame and charter policies for the nation. He's a champion of open market economy, and he works with facts and speaks freely. Please give it up for Padma Vibhushan Shri.Montek Singh Ahluwalia.
Mr. Mahalingam, Mr. Lakshmi Narayan, Mr. Kiran Shankar, Mr. Chandrasekhar, Mr. Madhavan, Ms. Archana Raghuraman, and lots of other people whose names I should also mention, but I was advised that I should stop at this point because there'd be too many people whose names deserve to be mentioned. And if I've missed anyone, Mr. Mahalingam is to blame because he's the one who put a quantitative limit. Let me first begin by saying that it's a real pleasure to come here. I'm very impressed by the work that United Way is doing. I looked through the brochure that was sent to me, and I've seen some of the presentations just now, all of them actually, and I'm really impressed. You know, when I came in, I pointed out that I was familiar with the name United Way when I used to work many, many years ago in the World Bank in Washington, D.C. Around Christmas time, there would be a bit of a collection, so we'd all contribute a little bit. And then I never heard of United Way in India. So, it's nice to know that this very well-established charitable mechanism is alive and well in Chennai. I said this must reflect something about the Chennai elite because, you know, when I was in government and also outside government, I get a lot of invitations to places to come and speak. But this is the only time that I've been invited by United Way, so I had the impression that it doesn't exist anywhere else in the country. But Mr. Mahalingam tells me that it actually does exist in Mumbai, but maybe they do other things when they're having their big annual meetings and don't want to talk about economics. But I do hope that you will spread out your tentacles, especially to some of the states in the north. To my mind, I mean, there's no United Way in Ludhiana. And yet, only a few years ago, I was told that more Mercedes are sold in Ludhiana than any other city in India. So it seems to me that, you know, there's a strong case for spreading the good work you're doing up in the north. I think this, you know, there is a viewpoint that many people have that, look, if a corporation is paying its taxes, then why should it get into all this stuff? I mean, the dharma of the corporates and indeed all rich people is to pay your taxes honestly. And after that, it's the job of the government to do these things. I don't actually agree with that because there is a human connect which people feel, which is not there when a government is involved. And quite rightly, whatever the government does, people take as a matter of right. And there should be more of that. But the idea of a human connect, where people feel, look, these guys are privileged in some way, and they're on their own trying to do something to help those who are less advantaged, that has a nice human touch to it. And frankly, if we are going to respectabilize the market economy, and we're all in a market economy, in the old days when people thought that maybe we don't have to be in the market economy, that's all gone. But if you're going to respectabilize the market economy, you need a lot more philanthropy. I mean, the story in the United States is precisely that it was the enormous amount of philanthropy done by people who in their earlier lives were actually robber barons, which respectabilized capitalism in the United States. Of course, the world is changing, so I don't know what's happening anywhere in the world anymore. But it seems to me that as we are going through this period, this is a message that should go out, and it's a pleasure to be part of a function which clearly reflects people who are conveying that message. So with those words, let me turn to what is the subject of today's meeting. Now, you know, I'm a little puzzled that this was meant to be a discussion on the budget. I understand that the normal thing is that you have someone, the budget's over, everybody has absorbed the first round effect, so you sit down and you get someone hopefully taking an intelligent view of the budget after some reflection, and then you have some very high-powered panelists who tear him apart. So that last bit is still coming. But, you know, we don't have a budget. We have an interim budget. Of course, it has made taken one or two initiatives which are unusually, if you like, forward or aggressive for an interim budget, but that's okay. But even the government does not say that this is the agenda for the next year if we get voted back. Because the Prime Minister has said this is a trailer. So there's no point, in my view, talking about a trailer. We might as well wait for the film when it's finally unveiled. And you know, my guess is that election time in the world's biggest democracy is pretty exciting time. I mean, globally, I think anyone who's interested in democracy should be taking a huge amount of interest in what the next 4 months in India are going to be like. Because you're going to have a multiplicity of parties, it's free, and nobody's voice is being suppressed, it's competitive, there are lots of parties in the field, and my guess is that they're all busy right now preparing their election manifestos. Now, which one becomes a film, I'm not going to predict. You can make up your own mind. But we don't know exactly what this film is. So what I want to do is, I want to, if you like, put across a few things which you as concerned citizens and voters and responsible voters should keep in mind when you see the promises that will be unrolled before you once the election gets going. Now, you know, I think that all political manifestos can consist of 4 things. And those 4 things are, number 1, slogans, number 2, targets, number 3, programs, and number 4, policies. Now, I'm not going to talk about the slogans. I'm not an expert in them. Though, let me say, by the way, slogans are very, very important. I mean, if you're ever managing an election, you better get the slogans right. And there are some slogans globally that people remember as having set the tone of the election. I remember when I was in college, when I went to England, they were all convinced that one of the best slogans that had ever been invented was Harold Macmillan saying, "You never had it so good." I mean, it's just before the world of tweets. I mean, he said it all in a few words. And then since then, different parties and different times have invented different slogans. Of course, in our own part of the world, perhaps the most famous and most successful slogan was Indira Gandhi, "Garibi Hatao," which actually most Indians don't realize, but it was after Zulfikar Ali Bhutto had produced a very similar slogan in Pakistan, which was also successful for him, "Roti, Kapra or Makan." So I don't know what the slogans will be. We have lots of slogans. I won't go through them. many. I don't want to mention one party's slogan and not mention another party's slogan. So we'll see these slogans. They're not very important. What is important, though, is the next three things. And those are targets, programs, and policies. Now, in a way, targets are what make programs specific. They enable you to judge, is that what you really want? They enable you to judge, did they deliver? And I think that, I hope that all these manifestos will be a little more precise than mere slogans and give us targets. Now, targets themselves don't tell you what they're going to do. They just make more precise what they're going to try to achieve. I mean, just as Indira Gandhi said, Garibi Hatao, that didn't tell you how the Garibi was going to be removed. Nor actually did it have a target, how much Garibi is going to be removed. Now, later on in the UPA, when we produced the 11th plan, we actually set a target. We said, over the 5 years of the 11th plan, we will reduce the percentage of the population in poverty by 10 percentage points. That was actually twice as fast as the previous period using the same data. Okay? So it was a target which was measurable, and as it happens, by the way, that target was achieved. The data at the end did show that we were able to do it, although at that time, I mean, nobody believed that it would be possible. And many people thought that liberalization actually goes against the objective of reducing poverty, and our whole approach was that the proper kind of economic reforms, obviously supported by the right kind of policies, would lead to a reduction in poverty. I think that similarly, you could think of targets in other areas. So what are those areas? I think that I have very little time because I believe much more interest in having what I say ripped apart. So I don't want to deny you that entertainment. But I want to make comments on three critical things, which maybe the panelists will also comment on. And I think they bring out some of the issues that maybe you need to raise when you meet different politicians. First issue is, what are our growth prospects? I mean, anybody going to an election ought to say what the growth target is. The second is, what you're going to do about agrarian distress. That's writ large, and everybody's talking about it. And the third thing is, what you're going to do about employment creation. So these are the three. There are many, many others, but you have to have other meetings for that. But these are three big ones that I want to talk about. Now, growth targets. I would like people to get up and say that this is my growth target. I mean, I prefer a number. Today, you get too much of we will become a $5 trillion economy by something, and we will become a $10 trillion economy by 2030. I prefer the old-fashioned approach, which says, look, this is what we've been growing at, and this is what we're going to make it. Actually, this 5 and 10 trillion business is pretty confusing, because if you look at it, normally people think that you're going to do better than in the past. That's an elementary thing. If you looked at the growth rate in the UPA 1 and the UPA 2 earlier, it was a well-known thing that UPA 1 was 8+%, and then UPA 2 slowed down to below 7. There are many reasons why it did, and one can go into that. But the interesting thing about that record was that UPA 1 demonstrated an ability to grow better than 8%. And at that time, everybody applying the smell test said, yeah, it is really growing. Whether it's sale of scooters, sale of television sets, sale of cement, whatever, it fitted into that spectrum. And what has happened is now we've got some revised data, which I don't think much of. And those revised data have pulled down the UPA 1 period to something like 7%. I won't go into the question of whether that's right or not right. But you know, what it does mean is that when you're projecting forward, it's no longer possible to say that, look here, we can go back to 8% because we did it before. We have, the official data have officially denied that we ever grew faster than 8%. Fine, forget, I'm not making, let the UPA fellows argue with the present government on whether that's true or not. The real question is, what is it that we're aiming at? The present position is that I think most people think that we are growing at 7+%, okay? International organizations have said that, you know, India can grow at, increase its growth rate and can go at about 7.5%. So that judgment, by the way, is very crucially dependent on the acceptance of the earlier numbers, which say that it grew at 8.5%. If you now formally downgrade those numbers, I think you should expect that most analysts will also downgrade the future prospects. Because a lot of the projections about the future are based on getting back to norm. And if the norm was never 8+%, then I wouldn't be surprised if people say, well, going to 7.5 on present prospects is not all that great. So in a way, those of you who go and project the prospects of the economy and the prospects of your company within that context may find that you may have to moderate some of the projections you make, okay? That's one point. I mean, I looked at what these numbers of doubling and trebling means, okay? Now, actually, if you start off by saying we are maybe $2.4 trillion economy now, some numbers, then if we grow at 8%, by 2030, we will be 5.6 trillion. Some newspapers have quoted government spokesmen as saying that by 2030, we are going to be a $10 trillion economy. According to my calculations, you know, to get to $10 trillion, you would have to grow between now and 2030 at 13.5%. So the first thing that really should be clarified is that are we aiming at 13.5% after having rewritten the national accounts data to eliminate the fact that we ever grew above 8%? I mean, that's a humongous kind of task to fulfill. My guess is there's some mistake in that 10 trillion. And so most people would say that, you know, we're trying to get 8% or maybe a little above 8%. I think if we are now at 7 and somebody says, I will get to 8, that's not, in my view, all that unreasonable. But you have to ask yourself, I mean, what is it that you think is going to get you there? So that's where you come into the programs and the policies part of the whole thing. And the question is, what do you need to get back to 8%? Well, I would put it as follows. Most economists would say that you don't have any chance of getting to 8% in an open economy if you don't maintain fiscal balance. That has to be a fundamental requirement for getting to 8%. Now, we can't judge. Whoever comes to power will produce the regular budget. And from the regular budget, the first question that has to be asked is, what does the regular budget say about the fiscal balance? At present, the interim budget basically has jacked up the fiscal deficit from what was earlier expected to be 3.1% to about 3.4%. That's not good at all. But what is worrying is that according to the CAG, this number does not include the off-balance sheet borrowing which the government does. I should mention, by the way, that I'm not making a political speech. This sort of fiscal fudging has gone on for years. I mean, I would say even during the time when I was in government, there was criticism, and I think that was a legitimate point, that the amounts due to be paid for the petroleum subsidy for a couple of years were not paid. And Rangarajan, in one of his reports, which was made public, criticized the then government. I mean, he was chairman of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, he criticized the government and said, look, you haven't fully stated what the fiscal deficit is. So the same thing tends to come up. And I think that as we move ahead, credibility in fiscal numbers is absolutely crucial. We are not, by the way, the only people who fudge fiscal numbers. I mean, the biggest fudge of fiscal numbers was Greece before the Eurozone crisis. I mean, the Greeks were quite happily telling the world that they're running a fiscal deficit of 6%, but actually it was 13%. And when they really went broke, one of the things the IMF did was that we just don't believe your statistics at all, and you have to get Eurostat to come in, because they're members of the European Union, to certify your statistics. Now, we must avoid that. And my good friend N.K. Singh, who chaired the Fiscal Responsibility Budget Management Act Committee, which Mr. Jaitley had set up to advise the government on the next round of fiscal trajectory, he made this very, very important recommendation, which had been made by Venu Reddy earlier in the Finance Commission. We must set up an independent fiscal council. That is not by all means, the finance ministry should produce the budget numbers, but there should be a full-time professional fiscal council responsible to Parliament, which looks at the budget numbers and says, these are the numbers. Now, whenever you set up such a council, it'll always quarrel. I mean, it's going to sort of do some criticism. It's like audits and so on. They have to make some criticism. But, if the government of the day says the fiscal deficit is 3.1%, and the fiscal council says, well, that's a bit understated, it's actually 3.15%, I don't think the world would fall down, but people would say, well, we should do it more carefully, etc. But if you get a situation where the government says 3.1 and the fiscal council says 4.2, that the rest of the world wants to look at. Now, why should the rest of the world need to look at it? It needs to look at it if you're an open economy and capital is flowing in and there is huge amounts of capital invested in our stock market, adding up to over $300 billion. It's an elementary requirement of due diligence on the part of the investors that they want to be able to know whether they are making these investments in an economy that is well managed. And rightly or wrongly, and I leave it to the panel to address that question, but rightly or wrongly, these guys do care about the fiscal deficit. In India, we have hundreds of debates. India, our attitude to the fiscal deficit is very funny, because, if any of you become finance minister one day, and you get up and say, I am busting the fiscal deficit by 0.5%, because I'm going to spend more money on investment, there'll be enough people saying, oh, you've done a huge stimulus to the economy, because investment is good for growth. Another finance minister says, I'm busting the deficit in order to give a huge tax relief, which is going to stimulate private consumption. There'll be any number of talking heads in the TV discussion panels saying, well, this has given a stimulus to growth on the consumption side. Very few people will get up and say that, look, while it may have done that, the real question is, if you're giving an investment stimulus and you're still maintaining the fiscal deficit, then you must be cutting consumption. So whatever stimulus you've done here is going to be canceled by the offsetting reduction of consumption. The other way around also holds. If, on the other hand, you're giving a stimulus and simply letting the fiscal deficit go through the roof, whatever you may think, you're not helping growth. You're undermining financial stability, which could come back in a big way to hit the economy. This is the asymmetry of the fiscal deficit. And let me assert once again, by the way, it's not small things. 3 point, I don't think that matters. But we don't actually have, and I'm now making a comment on both for the last 10, 15 years, we started the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act in the year 2003. That's a good example of multi-party agreement because it was Vajpayee's government that passed the act. It was the UPA that notified it. I mean, had the UPA not notified it, the act would have not been effective. And then they said, right, the UPA said, we are going to bring the fiscal deficit down to 3%, but 1 year later than was originally scheduled. That meant 2008, 2009. Then you had the global financial crisis. We bust the fiscal deficit. I think that was the right thing to do. Because when you have a major external shock, everybody busts their fiscal deficit. But we should have got back online. We didn't. Then the present government came in and they said, in the year 2019-20, we will be down to 3.1%. We are not. We are going to be at 3.4%. And that doesn't count the off-balance sheet liabilities. Now, people looking at this, in my view, if we set up a fiscal stability council, whichever government does it will be credited with having done a major institutional reform. And the reason for that is very simple. The pressures within any government to spend money are huge. But if you have an independent fiscal council, you're able to tell the cabinet that, look, you may think you can fudge it, but it's going to go through this independent fiscal council, which will pronounce what the... So I think that it's a recommendation that was made many years ago. It was repeated by the N.K. Singh committee, and I would hope that the governments to come would assert that we're going to do it. I'd certainly recommend to you that that's worth voting for, and I'm not saying which party. I hope all parties will do it, but that's an important issue. Now, coming back to the growth, is critical elements as far as growth are concerned. I think you have to make up your mind, is this going to be a public investment-led growth, or is it going to be a private investment-led growth? Now, some of my friends who yearn for state-led development would say there's nothing wrong with a public investment-led growth. Actually, in my view, you need a little more public investment than we've got, but you need a lot more private investment. And that is what has collapsed in the last 4 or 5 years. So there should be some policies where whichever party comes back to power says, please judge my performance by my ability to bring the private investment as a percent of GDP up from whatever it is to another 3 or 4 percentage points. That makes people wonder and think, what is it that will bring it up? So that's a second level. But at least it sets the right target if you want to get well above 7% growth. So that, in my view, is quite important. And clearly, it's a no-brainer that the biggest problem, one positive thing there is hopefully the GST will get rid of its many problems. I think if an incoming government were to say that we're going to cut down the number of rates, that would be a very positive signal. But remember, cutting down the number of rates means that, the 5% rate must go up to 8% or 9%. Now, I don't actually expect any party to say that. But if they say we're going to maintain the fiscal deficit and that we're going to have 2 rates of the GST, then they will bind themselves to something sensible. That would be a very meaningful thing in a party manifesto, and I'm certainly going to be looking for it to see if there's something substantive that's coming forward. Okay, there is no way that you're going to get the growth we're talking about if the problems of the banking system are not fixed. And that involves 2 things. Obviously, it involves recapitalization, whether that's to be done through bringing in more private investment or simply bunging in public. That's an issue. I suspect that politically, there doesn't seem to be a consensus anywhere. So I don't expect you to see in any party, this is unfortunate, but I don't expect it, that they say, well, we are not going to spend the money. In so many banks, we're going to go below 51%. If they did that, by the way, it would be very good, but I don't expect that. All right, if that's not going to happen, then they must say, what are the reforms that we're going to be doing which will make the public sector banks different? So some part, we should encourage our political representatives to lay that down. What are those reforms? Because we've been talking about it for the last 5 years, and I don't think any worthwhile reforms, nothing, there's been no answer. So actually the present position is we neither have a plan for recapitalization, nor do we have a plan for public sector bank reform. I think if we don't do anything on that very quickly, I think logically we should stop talking about 8% growth and simply say it'll be 7, maybe even less. Okay. Now I'm running out of time. Do I have another few minutes? Okay. Two other things: agrarian unrest, farmer unrest, and employment. You know, I think the whole agrarian farm unrest problem is being confused with the perception that farmers are poor and that we must help poor people bring their income up through some form of either universal basic income or cash transfer or whatever. There are many different programs that have come up. So in my view, the idea that you must give the poor additional income stands on its own footing as a matter of social justice and so on. It's not actually a particularly new idea. The idea goes back to Milton Friedman, of all people, most right-wing economist that you can think of, who recommended it in the United States many, many years ago as a negative income tax. So if your income is below a certain amount, instead of a tax, we give you a subsidy. Of course, it's difficult to implement that linked to our tax system, but the idea has come up and is being juggled around. In my view, that is not going to do anything for farm prosperity. The essence of farm prosperity is you have to have a faster rate of growth in agriculture. The rate of growth in agriculture in the last 3 or 4 years, it has slowed down, about 2.5%. We had targeted 4. In the UPA, we managed to get 3.6. It's now lower than that. So what is it that's going to cause that growth to happen? There are lots of hard decisions that have to be taken. That includes investment in agriculture. In my view, if you particularly look at what's happening on climate change, much more money needs to be spent on watershed management. 60% of our acreage is actually rain-fed. So talking about all these canals and big irrigation projects, that's actually pie in the sky. They're not even well conceived, technically and economically. In fact, Frontline, the last week of Frontline, I think it's Major General Wombat Kare or something, an excellent article on the linking of rivers scheme, which is actually poorly conceived, technically not feasible, and will be an environmental disaster. Frankly, everybody knows that in the government, but we've never actually, even in the previous government, we've never actually gone and said so. I mean, we always say, well, that's an interesting idea, and we'll examine it and so forth. But the fact is, we should be spending a lot more money to essentially capture the water where it falls and conserve it rather than let it run off during the rainy season into the sea. That requires a huge amount of investment, and I think that's part of the public investment that we need to do. Technology. I think there's a lot of confusion at the moment, and many farmer representatives are very worried. I mean, the role of GM technology has become highly controversial in India. The experience of cotton, for example, where GM cotton was brought in, BT cotton, has been phenomenal. I mean, we became a surplus producer. Production increased, exports increased, etc. Now, the present position, according to farmers, and I recently attended a meeting in Hyderabad, a convention of farmers, and they say that, look, we're not being allowed access to GM seeds because there are very strong vested interest against it, but we're importing edible oil made from GM oil seeds. So it's a completely inconsistent approach. And frankly, if you want to combat climate change, if you want to develop the kind of seeds that will yield higher production in our conditions, we need a clearer policy. Is GM technology acceptable or not? Because, scientists tell me that no young scientist wants to get into this research if there's no guarantee that if we find something, that they'll be allowed to test it. So again, I'm not saying, by the way, that we should implement. Today, the present position is that BT brinjal, which was held up in India by the previous government, not this government, is doing very well in Bangladesh. They're happily growing. BT brinjal production is going up, but we aren't allowing it yet. And there is complete lack of clarity. So I think we need to break through there. See, the other thing is, it's not just production, it's also the ability to market. And I think there are a lot of policies that have been talked about but have never been implemented. And for example, some of these things are in the hands of the state government and some are in the hands of the central government. The Essential Commodities Act is a policy that is in the hands of the central government. It is a no-brainer that nobody is going to invest in setting up warehouses and logistics chains and all the rest of it to buy farm produce if an order under the Essential Commodities Act can suddenly force you to disgorge whatever you stored based on what some district commissioner says. We have argued many times in the past, and not succeeded, I may add, that we should simply repeal the Essential Commodities Act. If you want private organized marketing of agricultural products, that's essential. And the states should get rid of the APMC, which actually prevents farmers from having a choice between the government-regulated market and a private market. Now, if you're serious about providing marketability, those are the reforms that should be presented. I mean, one can go on, I don't want to take too much time, but this is an example of, at a slogan level, the modernization of markets, everybody will agree. But at the policy level, the abolition of the Essential Commodities Act, nobody is agreeing to. So I think we need to go one beyond the slogan to the policy itself. My last comment is going to be on employment. That is quite clearly the biggest problem right now. I think it's a matter of success in India that we've got away from the perception that there's just too much poverty. People are just deeply poor, there's still poverty. Now, I remember when I was in the Planning Commission, when we revealed the data for the 2011-12 data, we said that, look, poverty, which was, 34%, has come down to, 23%. And I thought that this would be widely appreciated as an Indian achievement, but actually there was a furor in Parliament, and opposition members said that this is a fraud on the nation. We just don't, as if by conceding that poverty has gone down, you would be endorsing that the government has done a good job. Now, more recently, the Brookings Institution has said that poverty in India is now down to 10%. Since an election wasn't happening at that time, this was widely appreciated in the newspapers as a big achievement. So the fact is, that is an achievement. But the problem is that in the old days, it was enough to say that poverty has gone down. But today, that's not what people are any more interested in. You can get out of poverty because you get yourself a low-level, unsophisticated job, which gives you a minimum wage, and you don't have security, but you get a job. Today, the demand is that it's not enough to get a job. I want a decent job. What is a decent job? Well, the minimum is the wage rate. The problem with the wage rate also is that we have labor laws which encourage our industry to have a strategy where they keep certain employees who are on the permanent role, and all the rest of the work is done by contract employees. Now, look at what happens. Guy comes out of the rural areas where his income is very low. gets a job. It's not a secure job, it's a contract job. But if he's nice to everybody, behaves himself, respectful to the supervisors, I mean, he gets a job, it looks like a big increase in his income. But 2-3 years down the road, he realizes that, look, he's getting half of what somebody else is getting who's permanent, and he should be getting the same amount. So everybody who's got out of poverty, I mean, maybe they celebrate it for 1 year, but 4 and 5 years down the road, they're not celebrating that you've taken me out of poverty. Actually, they feel they've done it, which is true. They want to know, what are you going to do about the quality of jobs? And quite frankly, there again, one argument is we don't have data, which is also true. But we have lots of data, and all the data are showing that not enough employment is being created, but certainly all of them are showing that not enough good quality employment is being created. So the real question to ask is, to any political party, what are you going to do about jobs? Now, this goes back to growth. See, one view is that if you aim at 8 and 9% growth, in which case you should answer the questions that, what are you going to do to achieve it? You can reasonably say that, look, don't worry, lots of jobs will get created, and as the labor market tightens, they'll become better and better quality jobs. Though there are things you have to do to improve your labor market regulations, which is politically difficult. But if you don't go for that high growth, but you still assert that you're going to be able to get high employment, that's just a contradiction in terms. So this is the case where the targets have to be internally consistent. I mean, you're aiming at a high growth, then you should aim at a high private investment, also a little bit higher public investment, fit that into a responsible fiscal deficit. And then I would say that, if you do that, you need to ask yourself, why is industry not creating more jobs? And I think there are many, I won't go into that, but it's been well documented that Indian industry consciously prefers, and I don't blame them, consciously prefers to adopt a more capital-intensive technology because nobody wants to deal with too many people. Now, this is happening at a global time when, maybe artificial intelligence and robotics is being exaggerated as a problem, but there's no question that it's coming. It may not be very fast, maybe we have 5 years to go, but it's going to be there. And if we are going to integrate with global supply chains, then the choice of technology is going to be dictated by whatever the technology that they want in the supply chain. And that technology will be capital intensive. So you need a clear structuring. How is India going to handle this? We cannot be assuming that we are going to be independent of what's happening in the global economy. And I think we therefore need very clear statements. Are we going to integrate with the global economy or not? There's one view that says there is no other way. I happen to share that view. There is another view that says, no, why should you do that? For example, when you read all the newspapers on the RCEP negotiations, integrating with East Asia, there are any number of people saying that, no, this is too dangerous, it's very difficult for India. So I think we must ask the question, are we or are we not going to do what several governments have said? Narasimha Rao ji said, look east. Modi ji has said, act east. In between, people have been saying the same thing. The issue is right before us now. We are actually in a very interesting position globally because earlier, amongst the emerging markets, China was far ahead of India and integrating very rapidly and was generally also seen to be aligning itself with global trends in terms of democracy and all of that. That signal has now changed. The Chinese have quite explicitly said that, look, we're running a different system. So, since we are a democracy and we are open, we have an opportunity to persuade people that, look, we're not running that kind of a system, but for that, we have to at least do what is necessary on the economic side. So I would really look to the manifestos, whether they give that signal loud and clear, that we are going to integrate with the rest of the world, and we'll do what is necessary. And if they do that, then I think many things will begin to move in the right direction. I think I've really overstretched the time limit, but I've barely scratched the surface of the issues before us. However, I think I've given enough ammunition to the panel to rip apart my remarks, and I will be deeply disappointed if they fail in their duty to do so. So thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for listening. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. With your permission, if we can take a few questions from the audience. Great. So folks, we have time for maybe 3-4 questions for Dr. Singh here. Please raise your arms and a mic will come magically to you. One request though, please refrain from comments. Just make a quick introduction, your name, and have a brisk question so we can get as many questions as possible in the next few minutes. With that, who would like to go first? Over here, please.
Good evening, sir. Rakesh here. You are a great proponent of market economy. The question is, the market economy is no longer fully market determined. As we are seeing a lot of predatory pricing in retail, we see a lot of predatory pricing in telecom currently, and tomorrow it could be another sector. While the people who currently are in the sector have lots of money, but eventually it may lead to a situation of monopoly. My question to you is, should regulators now step in, protect industry, protect job losses? What should they do?
You know, there's an echo in the hall, so I'm not sure that I got all aspects of your question. But I think you were asking that I seem to be in favor of a market economy. And there are many people who think that market economies are not a case of simply letting the markets rip. I agree with that. Nobody who is in favor of a market economy should define the market economy as let the system rip and it doesn't matter. I mean, you do need a regulatory framework that will actually ensure that people are competing. And I think particularly with the modern developments, there are many things about IT and modern technology which actually encourage monopolies. And therefore, the normal rules of a competitive market do not apply. That's particularly true in these new online kind of activities. I don't have the answer to that, but I think we need a much more intelligent understanding that competition has to be regulated, and the regulation has to be intelligent. By the way, from the fact that competition has to be regulated doesn't mean that any regulation is good, because you can have exceptionally bad regulation, you can have regulation that doesn't understand what the purpose of the regulation is, but we'll live and learn. I mean, one of the interesting things here is we do have a competition commission, and we also have sectoral regulators. And what we are finding is that, you know, it's not very clear. If the concern is competition, and I think that is an important concern, should it not be done through the Competition Commission, which has a well-established tradition of consultation, where different stakeholders are brought in, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't have the answer to the question, but I do agree with you. You can't just wave a market flag and go home. You need a very intelligent government. You need a very responsive government. You need a sophisticated regulatory system which understands the complexities, both legal and economic, of doing this regulation. Now, you know, I mean, what we do is we have regulatory agencies where we put retired civil servants who, cannot be assumed to have any knowledge. There's nothing wrong with that to begin with. But I think we need to get beyond that to a system where you're staffing these places with the kind of expertise which I know is available in the country. And most importantly, I mean, for example, I would say that virtually no regulation should be issued without being put out in draft form so that you can get different comments. And one of the problems with a regulatory system where a person pronounces, once you've pronounced, any human being is not going to be able to say that I was wrong. But if you put out something saying, "But this is what I'm being told, what do you think?" there's a better chance that good sense will prevail. So we have a lot to do in that dimension. And I think, industry groups ought to sensitize the government to that, basically.
Go ahead. Since you have the mic.
So we've been talking for quite some time about the fall in private sector investments. Do you find it heartening in this context that according to RBI's consistent OBICUS reports, capacity utilization has been going up, and maybe that is why private investment is not happening. Maybe now it will happen because it's reached a certain level.
No, I accept the proposition that, what we've seen, too much of the debate becomes what happened in my period and what happened in your period. What we've seen in India is a big upswing after 2004. And, in any cyclical behavior of the economy, when things start moving up, irrational exuberance comes in. Banks also become irrationally exuberant. You get overinvestment, and you get a boom, and then you have a bit of a bust. If the government happens to change at just that, too bad. That's for the politicians to sort out. But business and economics should certainly recognize that when the bust ends and people find that the capacity utilization, we're now near capacity limits, then investment will start. But unless you knock it with something else. So in fact, in a way, this is a critical point in which all possible signals should be going that will support investment. And I'm sure that, if we had more time, we can, certainly on the tax front, for example, we need this most recent decision to set up a group to look at angel tax is a good decision. It should have been done 3 years ago. We're not nimble in responding in these areas.
Excellent. We got time for one more question, and the gentleman here.
Yeah, my name is Shashank, but this question is from my colleague Raghavi, who's deaf, she can't speak. She wants to know, when the government makes so much investment in skilling, why is it that such a large number of people are getting left behind?
Well, I shouldn't be speaking for the government, but I can talk about the skilling problem generally because, the previous government also emphasized skilling. We had a big effort at building up skilling, and I would say that to some extent, in my view, what has been missing in our skill efforts is it hasn't had enough of an involvement by the private sector. In the UPA, one of the key things we did was we set up private sector skill development council. I don't know if they continued with the present government, and the whole idea was that in certain clusters, the private sector would be intimately involved in doing the kind of skilling that was necessary. Okay? Whether that worked or not, I'm not sure. Because, it's all very well, you can bring in the private sector, but if the skill development is being done by a government institution, the private sector will occasionally say something, but if the management is not interested, they are not interested in having a fight with the management. So they say, well, look, you do whatever you like. I think what we need much more is apprenticeship, encouraging apprenticeships. And I remember when I was in government, one of the things that suddenly happened was, just as we were saying, look here, we must do more apprenticeships, two things happened. Trade unions objected to that, saying apprenticeships, which pay you much less than a full-time worker, are just a way of exploiting labor. So don't do this, okay? The other was that it's okay, you can do this, but you must force the company to employ these guys. This is another stupid idea, right? Now, frankly, if you can persuade the top 5 companies to bring in apprentices and they get a real certification by the top 5 companies, those guys would become sort of much more attractive for the next 5 or the next 10 or the next 20 companies. They don't have to get a job in the company that's, on the one hand, training them or hiring them. So I think we need to ask ourselves, why is it that Indian companies, unlike German companies, are not doing anything worthwhile on training. One of the reasons is that they are very scared that if they take on apprenticeships, you never know when somebody will not pass a regulation that you have to make them all permanent. So I think this is the kind of sudden changes in policy that we make which create a different environment.
Thank you. The hardest part is having a hard stop. Unfortunately, while it's disappointing, we do need to have a hard stop at this point. Can I request Mr. Mahalingam to come up on stage? Mr. Mahalingam, formerly CFO of TCS and currently board member of United Way Chennai. Thanks again, Dr. Singh.